Sarah grabbed us both by the arm and sat us down on the couch. "It's gone too far," she said. She slowly took off the blouse on top of her, raising her sleeves up. She was wearing only a black bra. She sat right in our environment and started running his hands around both of our legs. Maggie and I looked at each other in amazement. This is what we wanted, but when this thing happened, we were both afraid. Sarah noticed our timidity and ran her fingers over our lips. She was slowly putting his fingers in and out of our mouths. "Were you here?" "I was talking about the forbidden love between the three of us." "Then I'll have to start over." Maggie, my neighbor and best friend for the last 3 decades, had just come over to borrow some sugar. She always pretends it's about sugar or eggs or God knows what else, but I know she just likes the company. We're both widows now, you see, and when you've spent your whole life cooking for someone, a quiet kitchen feels like a ghost town. It was Maggie who first noticed the young couple moving into the house next door. "They're practically babies," she'd exclaimed as she peered through my curtains like a nosy old auntie. I chuckled, watching her watch them, her short gray hair catching the sunlight like a halo. I didn't care much at first. New neighbors come and go, don't they? But Maggie wouldn't let it go. "Have you seen her?" Maggie asked me one afternoon, the question hanging in the air like the scent of lavender from her perfume. "The wife. There's something about her. She's not like the others." Now, I didn't know what she meant at the time, but Maggie had a way of planting ideas in your head, like a gardener sowing seeds. Sure enough, when I finally did meet Sarah, the wife, I understood. She was magnetic. 27, newly married, with a laugh that sounded like it had traveled across lifetimes to find you. Her husband was fine, a nice enough boy, all smiles and handshakes, but Sarah? Sarah lingered. I suppose it started innocently enough. She'd come over to borrow a cup of sugar, see the pattern here, and I'd invite her in for tea. She had this way of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, even if all you were talking about was how to keep raccoons out of the trash. Maggie noticed it too. "She likes you," she'd tease, her lips quirking into that sly smile she saved for when she was right about something. "She's got that sparkle in her eye when she looks at you." It was ridiculous, of course. Or so I thought. I'm a 65-year-old woman, for crying out loud. What would someone like Sarah see in me? But then came the moments, little ones that added up to something I couldn't ignore. Like the way her fingers brushed mine when she handed me a teacup, lingering just a second too long. Or how her eyes would search for mine in a crowded room, like she was trying to tell me something without saying a word. I tried to brush it off, to chalk it up to my imagination, but Maggie wasn't helping. "You're not blind," she said one evening over wine. "There's something there, whether you want to admit it or not." The real turning point came one summer night. It was one of those nights where the air is so thick with heat that even the cicadas seem to hum slower. Sarah came over, barefoot and carrying a plate of cookies she'd baked. Her husband was away on a business trip, and she didn't want to be alone. We sat on my porch swing, the kind that creaks just enough to remind you of its age, and talked about everything and nothing. Somewhere between her stories of growing up in the city and my tales of raising 2 kids in this sleepy suburb, there was a pause. It wasn't awkward. It was the kind of pause that feels like the world is holding its breath. And then she looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "I've never met anyone like you." I didn't know what to say. I could feel Maggie's eyes on me from her window next door, though I'm sure she'd deny it. That was the moment I realized we'd crossed a line, Sarah and me. And the funny thing is, I wasn't scared. I wasn't confused. I was just alive. At one point, I realized our tea had gone lukewarm. "Let me freshen this up," I said, breaking the spell and standing up, needing the movement to distract myself. I took the cups inside, glad for the coolness of the kitchen, and busied myself at the counter. The simple act of pouring tea was grounding, but my mind raced. Did she feel it too? That undercurrent, electric and undeniable, simmering just beneath the surface? I didn't hear her come in. I turned around, expecting to find the empty space of the doorway, but there she was, standing in the soft glow of my kitchen light. Barefoot, her hair slightly tousled from the breeze outside, she looked ethereal. She leaned casually against the doorframe, but there was something in her eyes, a depth, a searching, that made my pulse quicken. "You didn't have to come in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I didn't want to sit out there alone," she replied, her tone light but carrying a weight that settled in the room. I turned back to the counter, focusing on the task at hand, but I could feel her presence like a charge in the air. As I placed the teacups on a tray, she moved closer. I didn't see her, but I felt her, the shift in the air, the warmth of her proximity. And then, without a word, her hand brushed mine. It was innocent enough. Or maybe it wasn't. The soft press of her fingertips lingered longer than it should have, and when I looked up, her gaze met mine. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever boundary we'd danced around, whatever line we'd carefully skirted, it had vanished in that moment. I started, but the words died in my throat as she stepped closer, her hand trailing lightly up my arm. "Should you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, to retreat to the safety of our porch and the pretense of polite conversation. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Her eyes held me in place, and the world outside the walls of my kitchen faded away. She leaned in, her face inches from mine, and for a fleeting second, I thought of Maggie. She was probably sitting in her living room, the TV murmuring softly, oblivious to what was unfolding next door. The thought should have snapped me out of it, but instead, it spurred me forward, like a dam breaking under the weight of a flood. When her lips brushed mine, it wasn't hesitant or tentative. It was certain, like she'd made up her mind long before I had. My hands trembled as they found her shoulders, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself get lost in the sensation. But then reality crashed in. I pulled back, the tray of tea forgotten on the counter. "Sarah," I said, my voice shaky, "we can't." Her expression softened, but she didn't step away. "I know," she said quietly. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" It was a dangerous question, one I didn't have the answer to. All I knew was that something had shifted irreversibly. The boundaries we'd crossed couldn't be redrawn, and the implications of that realization sent a shiver down my spine. "We have to stop," I said, more to myself than to her. I felt her breath then, warm against my cheek as she took another step forward. The space between us was almost non-existent now. The air around us had thickened, laden with something I couldn't name but instinctively knew would change everything. Her fingers, light as a whisper, brushed against my arm, sending a ripple of warmth through my skin. I stood still, my heart hammering in my chest, fighting the instinct to pull away, but something about her proximity felt like a magnet pulling me closer. I had always known Sarah was more than just a friend to me, but this was different. This was new, and it felt like the air had shifted, like we were no longer bound by the familiar rules of friendship. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly, her voice so close I could feel the words vibrate through me. I turned my head, meeting her gaze, but I couldn't answer. Fear? No, it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something dangerous, exhilarating, and yet, undeniably real. Before I could stop myself, I reached for her. The gesture was unconscious, an instinct I couldn't suppress. Her lips were soft when they met mine, hesitant at first, but quickly deepening as our bodies leaned into each other. The kiss, though it began slowly, quickly became more urgent, more pressing, as if we were both starved for something we hadn't realized we needed until that moment. Her hands found their way to my back, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against one another. The kitchen felt small in that moment, the walls closing in as the tension between us built. My hands roamed, guided by a desperation I didn't want to name. I could feel the heat of her skin through the fabric of her blouse, the pulse of her heartbeat matching mine in a rhythm that seemed to be driving us both to the edge. It was just at that moment that the door knocked. It was Maggie. Sarah and I exchanged a quick glance, a glance that seemed to convey everything and nothing at the same time. "I have to take this," I muttered, my voice trembling. I started to move away, but Sarah grabbed my wrist and stopped me for a brief moment. "Wait," he said softly, his voice a little desperate. "What if he sees us like this?" I swallowed hard, the tension in my chest was making it difficult to breathe. I could hear Maggie's footsteps now, faint but clear. Maggie, my friend, my neighbor, and now. What? Is this the third part of the equation? I felt the weight of everything that had happened come crashing down on me, my breathing quickened as my mind raced. I never wanted this to happen, not like this. But it was already happening. "I'll talk to him," I said, trying to look more confident than I felt. I nodded to clear the fog and forced myself to focus. I opened the door and saw Maggie standing there, her eyes wide, her facial expression both curious and a little worried. She was dressed haphazardly, there was a soft smile on her lips, but her eyes were directed at me, then at Sarah, standing just inside the house, and I could see the tension radiating from her. He didn't say anything for a moment, he just stood there, his gaze moving back and forth between the two of us, an unspoken question hanging decently in the air. "Hey, Maggie," I said, trying to look normal, but I could hear the tension in my voice. He bowed his head slightly, his eyes narrowed, suspicion was evident in his look at both of us. "I was just at home," she said with a little shrug, although her smile seemed a little strained now. "I thought I'd drop in and see how things were going." His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than usual. I could feel Sarah's presence behind me, I could feel her hesitations. Her hand rested warmly and tremulously on my arm, her fingers lingered for a second. Then Sarah, unexpectedly, grabbed Maggie by the arm and pulled her as if inviting her in. Now all three of us were in a secret relationship. Sarah grabbed us both by the arm and sat us down on the couch. "It's gone too far," she said. She slowly took off the blouse on top of her, raising her sleeves up. She was wearing only a black bra. She sat right in our environment and started running his hands around both of our legs. Maggie and I looked at each other in amazement. This is what we wanted, but when this thing happened, we were both afraid. Sarah noticed our timidity and ran her fingers over our lips. She was slowly putting his fingers in and out of our mouths. Sarah, with an inviting gesture, got out of our environment and left us to each other. We started kissing innocently. Maggie and I have been close friends for many years. Then Sarah grabbed our head and pulled it towards her belly. Every time we kissed her belly button and every tongue stroke, little moans came out of her mouth. Those kisses started from her navel and slid down to her crotch. The violence of the moans was increasing even more. As those sounds increased, we were passing out. The three of us lay down on the couch and started rubbing. It didn't take long to satisfy each other. At that moment, the three of us were not separate bodies, but one body, one soul.